Good evening. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this online Melbourne launch of Linda Javin's terrific book, The Shortest History of China. My name is Beck Strading. I'm the Executive Director of La Trobe Asia at La Trobe University. I would like to begin the event tonight by acknowledging the elders of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which La Trobe University sits. And I would like to pay my respect to their people, both past and present, and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians who might be joining us this afternoon. La Trobe Asia is proud of our efforts to engage the public in thoughtful debate and to deepen our understanding and our knowledge of the region in which we live. And it really does give me great pleasure to welcome Linda Jaivin to the virtual La Trobe Asia stage to celebrate her recently published book, The Shortest History of China, which has been published by Black Ink. Now, this was originally going to occur at the State Library of Victoria, and we just missed out with the timing as we went back into lockdown, but we're really delighted to have you here joining us via Zoom from Sydney. And I'm sure that Linda needs no introduction for many of you joining us tonight. Linda is an internationally published author of 12 books, a translator, an essayist, novelist, and specialist writer on Chinese politics, language, and culture. She is the co-editor of the China Story Yearbook and an associate of the Australian Centre on China in the World at the Australian National University. Welcome, Linda, and congratulations on the publication of this book.
Thank you so much, Beck. It's so nice to be here. I wish I were there in person, but...
We'll make it happen at some point, but we'll make do with Zoom for the moment. And we are also very privileged to be joined this evening by two leading academics in Australia who are experts in understanding China in their own right. I'd like to welcome Dr. Ruth Gamble, who is a lecturer and Australian Research Council DECRA Fellow in History at the School of Humanities and Social Sciences here at La Trobe University. Ruth specialises in the histories of Tibet and the Himalaya, with a particular interest in the region's rapidly changing environment. Welcome, Ruth.
Thank you. Very glad to be here for Linda's book.
And last but not least, it's terrific to have with us Professor Baogang He, who is the Alfred Deakin Professor and Personal Chair in International Relations at Deakin University. Baogang has research expertise in a range of topics, including Chinese politics, theories of international relations and democratization, and Asian regionalism. It's great to have you here, Baogang.
Thank you, Beck.
We do have a discount code for the book that Diana will put in the chat function, and this will also be sent out with the email notification for this event. I highly recommend, if you haven't had a chance to purchase the book, that you should get your hands on it. It is a terrific read. And there will be an opportunity for some audience Q&A in the last part of tonight's session. So please do put your questions in the Q&A box throughout the evening, and I will pose them to our expert panel when we get to that part. But Linda, I would like to begin with you. I mean, it's really a remarkable achievement that you've managed to distill this vast, complex history into a relatively short book and managing to keep it lively and informative and coherent is really, it's a great achievement. And you say in the intro, I love this in the intro when you say that a wise person would choose to focus on a few things, but you're just going to focus on it all. And I love that approach, because you do this magnificent job of revealing the patterns and the threads that recur in the sort of rising and the falling of the empires across 2 millennia. So I wanted to ask you, I mean, what do you consider to be the kind of the key narratives or the key stories of change and continuity across this vast and messy history?
Such an interesting question. I would say two of the big changes, we're looking at the really big picture, is China in ancient times was a very rural and agrarian-based society, and cities began to be important around the 11th century with the Sung, but we've seen really accelerated urbanization in recent years, and it's a huge change for Chinese society, demography, economics, and so on. So that's just one big, broad sweeping change. Another one, which I think is really interesting, is that of the function and the reach of literacy. So Chinese characters were invented, the very first Chinese characters, around 3,500 BCE. And there's always been, since Confucius in particular, who was about 500 BCE, a great respect for the written word, for written texts and so on, and the people who could read them. And so there was this great, the role of the educated people was quite an important one. They were the ones who would serve the rulers and so on. But they were always a small number of people within the society, and women were not generally privileged to be literate. Some were, and they were amazing early historians and so on, but it was a very privileged position to be literate. And that began to change as well with time, and now we've seen mass literacy. So that's another big sweep and a shifting of who are the elites and who are not, and all that. And then other big thematic continuities are the vulnerabilities and of various ruling houses to corruption as something that can bring down a government. And I think we saw that, we've seen it in so many different dynastic houses where everything was going fine until they stopped worrying about what the corrupt were doing to the people. And then rebellions happened and everything kind of went topsy-turvy. That's one of the reasons we see Xi Jinping, the first thing he does when he comes into office in 2012 is launch an anti-corruption campaign. Other anxieties that have, anxieties and themes that have continued, one is that of unity and disunity, and the fear of disunity. So Chinese history has had lots of periods when there has been no central government, no central authority, when things have broken up and the whole country is divided into warring or at least competing states. So that was, and that fear of that it exists to the present day, this fear of disunity, of the fragility of unity, and the fact that it's also been in Chinese philosophies of rule from very ancient times, again, back hundreds of years BCE, that if you don't have order, you have chaos. It's a cycle, and if you and it really is kind of an absolute thing. So you lose the order and you get chaos. That's another big continuity. And I would finally just mention very quickly, another thing is anxiety and attention to the borders, because China, unlike many countries, has borders with so many different other countries in the past, different peoples, different tribes. The Great Wall was an attempt to keep the northern border secure. But you have these incredible periods where other tribes were absorbed into the empire. This is why China is a multi-ethnic country, but you also had lots of periods where the greatest fear came from those threats on the border. I mean, in the Tang Dynasty, just to raise one little example, which Ruth would know a lot more about, is that in the Tang Dynasty, the Tibetan kingdom, which was an independent kingdom, raided and sacked the Tang capital of Chang'an. This is a real threat to power, these various things. And at different times in Chinese history, the invaders have been the rulers. So the Mongols ruled in the Yuan dynasty, for example, and the last dynasty was ruled by the Manchus, who were another tribal group from the Northeast. China eventually absorbed those peoples, and they are now ethnic minorities. So these are various, I mean, there's many things, but I would just name those to start with.
Well, it's certainly a good place to get the conversation started, and I want to come back to those themes, but particularly what you're talking about with that last point, or the last 2 points really, around order and chaos and fear of fragility and the anxiety around the authority being sort of broken up, if you like. I wanted to ask about this because Beijing celebrated its 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party in July this year, and it seems like that tendency towards trying to centralize authority is part of that story of the history of China. And you make some really important points in the book about how China is used by the Chinese Communist Party. And so I wanted to ask about, or ask you to sort of explain, how is it that the past is used or abused by China's leaders? And what are the sort of, the political and social implications if history is not subject to free and open and critical scrutiny?
It's such a great question. It's such an important one. I think that we have to take it back, however, into the past first and say that every dynasty has been concerned with how history is written. So every dynasty writes the history of what came before. And it's an attempt to control that history, to manage it, but it's also an attempt to draw lessons from it that will help in coming up with a better way of ruling, and so the writing of history has always been a big concern. It's a huge concern right now. And one of the reasons is that, some of you may have heard of a campaign against historical nihilism, which is going on right now. Xi Jinping talks about historical nihilism, and it seems really weird. Like there's a campaign against girly boys, and there's a campaign against it, and you can kind of see where he's coming from. You don't agree with it, but you can see why they're worried about various aspects of social order. But what is historical nihilism? It is telling the story of China differently to the way the party tells it. That's basically historical nihilism. Why is it important? Xi Jinping is convinced that that is one of the reasons that the Soviet Union fell apart, is that they lost control of the historical narrative. So that just tells you how important holding on to the historical narrative is to Chinese rulers in general and to Xi Jinping in particular. Now, some of the implications, they're quite serious. So what happens is, I'll talk about two aspects of this. I think everybody has probably heard of the century of humiliation. Now, that's not just a propaganda thing. It is a propaganda thing, but it's actually real. There was it was a century beginning around 1840, in the 1840s, with the Opium Wars. That next century was marked by imperial powers enforcing themselves on China, carving up its resources for themselves to exploit, establishing semi-colonial territories within Chinese ports, and so on. It was deeply humiliating. They forced the Qing government at the time to give them money in compensation for the terrible things that they had done to China. Basically, it really was a century of humiliation. Now, in 1911, the Republican Revolution was thwarted in many ways by a lot of internal problems and an inability to figure out how to establish a republic, but it was also thwarted by continuing assaults from outside, from the Japanese in particular, from the Japan and Russia. In 1904, before the thing, they fought a war on Chinese soil over who would dominate the Northeast. That's unbelievable. So the Communist Party's use of that history is to say, 1949, the Communist Party established the People's Republic of China, and that was the end of the century of humiliation. So it uses that history to say, be thankful for us. We are the legitimate rulers of China. On the other hand, to very briefly express some of the dangers of over control of the narrative of history, and I quote a historian called Yuan Weishi, who in 2006, I quote him in the book in 2006, he talked about how education in China did not explore, for example, the reason why the Yuan, the great palace of the Qing emperor, was sacked by the British and the French. And that was because a negotiating team had been tortured by the Chinese officials and tortured, many were murdered and so on. That sparked a need, perceived need to take revenge on China, but they wanted not to sack Beijing. They thought they will go directly for the emperor's beloved Yuan. So they burnt that down. If Yuan Weishi, this historian, said, if you don't teach people this, then you incite a kind of a narrow, inflamed nationalism that's very dangerous, because people think we are the victim. There's no reason why people did this to us. It's not saying that that reason is a justification, but you have to have the whole story to be able to draw the lessons of history. And he also talked about other examples. So I think what happened was he published this article, the publication got shut down, they had to make a retraction, and today there's no way anybody would publish anything like that.
Wow. So yeah. I think we'll get back to the century of humiliation a little bit later, because it does seem to be quite a significant part of the use of the historical narrative and an explainer of some of the actions that China takes in its international relations and its defence posture. But I wanted to ask, one of the most amazing parts of the book that I absolutely loved were these amazing stories of powerful women in Chinese history. There could definitely be another book or multiple books, I feel, coming out of some of the characters. And these seem to be traditionally left out of histories of China. And so I wanted to ask, why is it that these histories tend to be sort of pushed aside? And what do we gain from having a better understanding of the role of women and the sort of the forgotten tales of powerful women in particular?
So I'll take the first part. Why do we not have them? Who writes the histories? The men. And that's one part of the answer. The other part is, what is actually recorded at the time? Very little is recorded of the lives of women, and actually very little is recorded of the lives of ordinary people. So we get a lot from poetry, from court records and so on, if we want to put together, from tax records and censuses and so on. But there are records of what emperors ate, but there's not records of how women lived. So it's a kind of using indirect sources a lot of the time, and they weren't considered important. They were just the wives and the mothers, and because they didn't have a lot of public roles, generally speaking, they weren't considered worthy of recording. But there were some who were recorded in history. So we are very lucky. Some wrote poetry and we know about them. Others made inventions, so we know about them. There were some who were warriors. I mean, Mulan is probably a composite. I don't think there was a single Mulan. There's no evidence for that. But you get these amazing women, and I think what do we gain? We gain a view of history that's not 50% of the country. If we just look at 50% of the country, we're only going to see half of the story. And so I think that it's kind of evident. We also get this sense of, I think there's some cliches, especially about Chinese women and traditional women and so on. The bound feet was something that was imposed on women and became a really horrific impediment to mobility. It was an imposition of a very painful breaking of the feet for initially aesthetic purposes and kind of erotic, and then it became a method of control. Endorsed by Neo-Confucians of the Song dynasty, and then it was just custom. But we also have these amazing characters, and to bring them out, and I'll just name two very quickly. One of my favorite people in the book is a late Qing dynasty feminist who was the daughter of a Qing dynasty general who gave her a boys' education and taught her martial arts. She then studied bomb making with Russian anarchists. And she led an all-female militia in the 1911 revolution. And when Sun Yat-sen failed to give women the vote, as he had promised, She then led her girls to the Legislative Assembly, and they broke the windows. They kicked the guards to the ground. It was a little bit January the 6th, but I think a little bit more sympathetic. And as a newspaper report said, she twisted the beard and boxed the ears of a legislator with her dainty little hands. These are like amazing stories. I just love them. And another thing on a kind of a more serious thing is, I don't think many people know that China's first computer was the result of a woman leading. She was like China's leading computer scientist, and she led the team to build China's first computer. We have to know these stories.
Outstanding. I mean, it's just there, and the book is full of interesting facts around things like that. But Ruth, I wanted to bring you in here because it was a few months ago now when those of us in Melbourne weren't in lockdown and we were on campus. And I remember we were getting a coffee and you said to me that what you really value about this book is that it makes the case for why it's important to understand history, why it's important to understand China's history. So I'd like to begin by asking you, why do you think it's important for us to understand China's history? And how does getting a handle on some of these dominant themes over 2,000 years really assist us with understanding contemporary China?
Okay, I think it's kind of this book as well. I've got to start by saying that pay homage. I don't know if that's the right word, to Linda's ability to be able to get right into the words and to craft words and tell you a story about something that's so epic. And it kind of brings together this like amazing translator and a storyteller coming together to tell us this story, right? So I think that's like a key, and it needs to be respected because we don't respect translators enough in Australia, I don't reckon, and she's just anyway. So it's bringing those two things together. But I think that for me, the thing that history does is not just explain the present to you, but explain the kind of contingency of the present and express alternatives. There's things in this story that could have happened, that could have created a different present, right? And there's things in it that really that you get a sense of. The thing that I really loved about it the most was, and I've kind of missed being in my little apartment, is that Linda's really brought to light the best thing about China, which is the people. There's so many stories of people in here, and it's one of, I mean, I know it sounds strange to say it's the most human place because it's so populated, but there's so many different stories, and people tend to just have this idea of China, and it's like, no, there's like 1.5 billion stories there, and they're all different, and they're all interesting, and they're really fascinating, and there's all of these different ways to think that you can approach that story. And so in this one, I was thinking that one of the things that makes you understand China now is that the key role that the Chinese people have played in their history, and not just the governments. I think that's really important. There was something in it that I always kept, there's an idea in Chinese history that, as an environmental historian, I think is the biggest thing that could help the planet at the moment, which we've kind of let go, and it seems to me it's let go in China, which is Wu Wei. So I keep thinking, like, learning about the ideas that haven't been centered, that were important at different parts of the history. And Wu Wei, I think Linda can probably explain it better than me, but this idea of doing as little as you can, right? And I think that like drawing things out of history that could be really helpful is great. And also, I think you can understand the things that might be a bit negative from different angles. Right. So like I'd say one of the things that distresses me the most about China at the moment is actually the patriarchy. And I think when people are talking about issues with the Chinese government at the moment, like the biggest thing they're talking about is that they have a bunch of like upper class blokes sitting in a room making decisions. And it's like, where are the women? Where are the scientists? You know, where, like, I mean, they're all scientists, you know, but where are the women scientists and the women with different experiences? So I think that Linda's book tells us all of these things. It tells us how we've got there. And I should also say that given that I think that one of the biggest issues we're looking at is actually patriarchy, it's really great to have Linda's voice as opposed to most of the people who seem to be talking about China a lot at the moment without that kind of historical background.
Well, we might dig into that in a little bit, talking about our understanding of China in Australia. But first, I wanted to ask you, Baogang. I mean, in the field of international relations, we hear a lot about China's motivations, its activities, and there's a lot of assertions that what it's doing in a range of different activities is rooted in its history, particularly the century of humiliation that Linda referenced before, and this popular notion that China was once this central civilization in the world, and this is the kind of world order that it's seeking to replicate today. And some see this obviously as a threat to an alternative vision of order that may be led by the US, for example. So how accurate are these narratives, in your view, in explaining China's contemporary politics and its relations with other states in the world? Or do we need a much more nuanced understanding of how the past drives the present?
Sorry, yeah. Thank you, Beck. And the story about central humiliation you mentioned in the answer is, generally speaking, is accurate. But I think how the past history driven contemporary Chinese strategic consideration need more deep, more kind of complexity. I think Linda's book offers a very valuable lesson. I'll go back her book if any reader are interested to read. Just go back first, page 83 to 84. Linda mentions the Song Dynasty. And that period, it's an amazing story that the Song and the Liao had a 120-year peace. Now this, we should, if we look about how history driven today, I can say this is a lot lesson for us to learn from it. How can we repeat this successful story in contemporary? How the United States, China can manage the great power rivalry and maintain for 100 years peace? Is everyone happy now today in this world? So I think this is so rich that book touch on this issue, and Liao cannot take over the Song. Song want to reclaim the territory, but then defeat several times. Then each side realize the best you can make a deal. Then in the Taiyuan, they signed the peace deal. And this is amazing story. Now, if we think about this, how China, this Song Dynasty, the emperor manages the power rivalry with the Liao Dynasty. There is through today what we might call this competitive partnership or rivalry partnership. I see the Grant Ellison, a Harvard professor, makes story about this Liao and the Song peace treaty. They said, now look, historically, Song pays a tribute to the Liao every year, about 300,000 silk or silvers. And then the Liao, in return, invest those payments into economic, scientific, technology development in Song Dynasty. So then this kept the peace for 120 years. So if you think about Western history, Western failures, it was celebrated as a great a success, which lasted under about 90 years peace without war. That was a great success. But if you look at the Chinese history, offers, it's an amazing story, 120-year peace. So I think their book, the Linda's book, really offers some of the nuances. We probably need the central humiliation is one story, and we need to dig out, like Linda mentioned in her book. There's another deep history of us here, how China can accommodate the other power, make a peace. I think that we can learn a great deal from Linda's books.
Yeah, it's a really important point.
Thank you.
It is a really important point about what we choose to take from history and how we choose to interpret that, for some of our own ends, I guess. But I wanted to go back to one of the points that Ruth was making about, who is talking about China in the kind of, I guess, the public discussions and the public discourse. And I wanted to ask all three of you, and I'll start with Ruth. Do Australians know enough about Chinese history? And if you think, and if they did know enough about Chinese history, do you think that it would change some of the current debates that are currently occurring, particularly around China's role in the global order and the sort of discussion around threat that is currently playing out in public discourse?
Gosh, you'd hope so. Couldn't be worse. There's things. It's almost as if through telling the stories of China, you do understand these things of like what people are carrying with them, right? And also how they understand the world. I don't know though. I almost feel like in some ways it would be better to learn some of the language and those ideas as well as the history, because it's how you understand the framework as well as just the history. And I think that's what Linda's done here, is she hasn't just told us this happened, then this happened, then this happened. We've got like plays in there and novels that were really important, and movies and fashions, and a real sense of like things that you can that frame that shape their understanding of the world. And that's what I feel like is really kind of lacking in a lot of the ways that people talk about China. It's always like it is an authoritarian government. There is issues there that we need to deal with, and I'm not meaning to kind of skate over those, but sounds bad to say but after that. But there's we've got to think about, okay, what's going to help people on the ground, right? And it seems to me that there's the kind of, if you have a government that is trying to articulate its strength, and you come at it I don't know, just being blustering and not try and understand and try and work with and think about the fact that it's made up of people, then things get more complicated and the tensions rise. So if we could kind of take a step back, think about the times when there was peace. And that's the other thing I keep thinking about reading this book, and from what Baogang has said, and looking at the media and at the moment, it's like we've got to start talking about peace again. I remember that in primary school, we had to keep saying peace is really important, but it seems like we've got to start talking about that again. And I find that really kind of disturbing. So if we can think about the idea that this is, because I feel like quoting Sting now, which is getting depressing, but it's that idea of like, that it's full of all these people. And if we can get to like connect with the people in this story and stop having the idea of a threat in our head, and have the idea that there's that many, like I don't know, the Russians love their children too. Remember that song? I keep thinking that that China is full of all these people that we can meet in Linda's book. Then we can start having a conversation again. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, it does. It does. I mean, you're very articulate, Ruth. It's a really important point. And Linda, I'm wondering whether you wanted to respond to that point.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And it's one of the reasons that, and I constantly, I listen to podcasts from China, and I listen to one called 故事 FM, which is Story FM, and it's all these different people's stories. And there's another one called Stochastic Volatility, which is by these 3 young feminists. And it's astonishing. And then and I tell people about these, and they're like, how do I get onto it? What's the name again? I'm like, you have to know Chinese. So the point about learning Chinese, and it's very frustrating. I actually wrote a piece about podcasts to try to introduce some of this stuff, that this notion that China is so many different voices and so many different personalities, and all of this is so important. And I also really agree that we need to, it's not about caving in. It's not about saying, oh yes, well, Xi Jinping is great. It's nothing like that. But we need to understand where the Communist Party and its leadership is coming from when they talk about things, so that when we talk back or talk with, that we don't step on landmines that are just sitting there, sticking out of the ground. Sometimes you feel like our leadership just goes over and goes, oh, that's a really sensitive point, but I don't understand that, and so the understanding of history, the understanding of of Chinese communist rhetoric and what it relates to and the sensitivities of history would be such an important guide to achieving what Baogang was saying. I mean, one of the interesting things about the Song dynasty and that 120 years of peace was that the founder of the Song, he was forced to be a rebel in the sense that he was a military commander, and China was a whole bunch of different warring kingdoms at that point, and he was leading his troops to go protect their infant ruler. And I have this story in the book, and they were going to protect the infant ruler, and one night they were very close to the capital, and he woke up in his tent, and his soldiers were arrayed around him, and they had their swords, and they had a yellow robe, which is an imperial robe, and they said, you are going to be the emperor. We are going to depose the infant. And he was so angry, but he said, okay, but what he did was he then took the military and really put them under control. As a result, he said, you will obey me. We will not kill that infant. We will not harm that family. And one of the things he did, very differently from a lot of other rulers who had to deal with putting together a kingdom from a bunch of, disparate, disunified states, is he said, first we try negotiation, and then we try, we do everything to avoid war. We use war as the last resort. It's really interesting to know about these different models, as Baogang was saying, and as Ruth was saying. I think there's so many things that we can avoid creating more unnecessary friction. There's some necessary friction and there's unnecessary friction. And I think we stumble into the United States, Australia, we all stumble into this stuff because of ignorance of history. And I think we can become more literate about China. More people should study Chinese. More Chinese Australians should come into politics, and come into journalism and become voices, who can help us, who help people who don't speak Chinese hear more voices from China and hear what's going on there. Because again, it's not a thing about surrender. It's nothing like that. We just need to connect in a more intelligent way and a more informed and literate way.
A very compelling case there. And Baogang, I wanted to bring you in here. There is also a question in the Q&A I can see that links into the original question that I asked, and that is about Australia's diplomatic relationship with China. And would that be different if Australian leaders and the public had a better understanding of China's history?
Definitely, if the Australian diplomatic will fully inform Chinese history, know the detail, how the Chinese diplomacy operate in real life, they probably would have a better way to manage the current situations. I would like to kind of go back on my earlier remark, that is to learn the Chinese history, we need to go to the deeply, go to those details, and how the Chinese manage the great power rivalry differently from West Europe. In particular, they said they try to manage a rival partnership. At the same time, like Song still competing with the Liao aggressively, but at the same time, they maintain this cooperation without war. So there are small conflicts still going on. I think that we can learn this great history to how to develop this rivalry partnership, that strategy applied to the United States and Australia. I think that currently, if we think talking about Australia, just only goes one way: prepare the worst case and focus on threat. But they forgot the other part of the story. China have, I think Linda make a really good points, like the Song Dynasty. They try to kind of, when the power is rising, the best way they think is king win, Wang Dao. But the West tends to dismiss it as a kind of propaganda, rhetorical. But Linda mentioned Zhou Huangyin. Actually, he did practice this principle, at least at least 60%, I think, more than 60%. So that's a way to try to understand how the Chinese not indeed can't have this kind of practice. Then you develop some sort of collaboration. So currently just fully focus on the conflict, the war. And then if you take China as an enemy, then China become enemy, then they will fighting back. So how we can kind of take China as a sort of competitive rivalry, but at the same time continue to develop the collaboration. So the higher education across the whole world are highly integrated. And this is amazing. And plus migrations, also new conditions. The Song dynasty did not help. So the modern time, actually we have a more better condition to manage a great power rivalry. But unfortunately, I think even the Chinese leader too, if you answer your question, do Australia know enough about Chinese history? I can also say that Chinese probably does not know enough about Chinese history too. The Chinese only pick up the conflict, competitive, that's part of the story. But they forgot about the Chinese have a great skill, manages this competitive historically. They forgot this lesson. Song and Liu offer with a great lesson. I think that people can learn a great deal from Linda's book. And one story I can mention, Linda, I think that your book is you mentioned this woman. I found that you mentioned Zhao Huangying. I think that story should be talked about. Zhao Huangying's mother. He's a great politician in Chinese history. So before the Song, there there's a fighting for a long, long time. So the Zhao Huangying is the first emperor. His mother figured out why those new political region cannot last, because succession problem. Always the young babies put into throne to be a new emperor and too young to control. So before he passed away, he made a deal with the two sons that the younger son must succeed the older son. And he even forced asked another prime minister, the minister, write down her will. You must follow it. So this is a mother manages a great succession in a family way, and peaceful, and deliver peace. I think that story will be so important for us to understand contemporary Chinese politics. So we always understand the Chinese politics in terms of democratic succession, election, elected new leader. But probably go back to Chinese history, how she later on managed succession, peaceful way, and without conflict. Now this is a really story that we can learn a lot from Chinese history.
Yeah. Can I say something to that?
Yes,
that there's some beautiful stories like that, but there's also throughout the book the stories of horrendous successions of fraticides and the murder of sons by their fathers and fathers by their sons. Oh, it's just, and then mothers murdering the children of concubines, and I mean, it just goes completely. It goes completely crazy in many, many cases. And I would say that, I mean, I love that story, but I also think that one of the big lessons of Chinese history is that you have to manage succession. If you don't manage succession well, it can go so violent and so bad. And that's one of the reasons that when we look today at, so Mao, when he came to power, there was no succession plan. In Yan'an, before the communists came to power, a Chinese journalist asked Mao, he said, you know, succession has always been a huge problem with dynasties. You know, the actual, like what you're talking about is the exception. The rule is violence and chaos and, you know, killing and all this sort of thing. And so he said, what are you going to do about it? And Mao told this Chinese journalist, he said, democracy.
That's right. Yeah.
He seems to have understood in his own way. But anyway, Mao comes and there's no plan for, well, the plan for succession is it's going to be his closest comrade in arms, Lin Biao, who then in 71 suddenly drops out of the sky in a plane and the Chinese people are told that he was planning to assassinate Mao. So, whoa, what happened to that succession plan? You know, that wasn't very good. Mao dies, and then the succession it was a piece of paper which said, with you in charge, my heart is at ease. But then there's questions about that piece of paper. Was it referring to succession? Was it referring to something else? Deng Xiaoping, when he became, in effect, China's, ultimate leader after 1978. In fact, he only held one position. It's kind of an interesting story. But Deng Xiaoping thought one of the big problems is still succession. It's still plaguing China. So the Communist Party in the early 80s established the 2-term limit. That is what they said would stabilize this problem of succession that has plagued Chinese history. And what has Xi Jinping done? He's abolished it. So
That's right, yeah.
the story goes on. We'll see.
Yeah, indeed. We have quite a few questions coming into the Q&A. Terrific to see. We've got a couple of questions that I'm going to try to combine for you, Linda, on literacy. And one of the bits of the book that I really enjoyed was when you're talking about characters, Chinese characters, and the development of the characters. And there's a graphic in there, and it just, it's just one of the points of the book where you can get a lot of detail in a sort of a short period of time. It's very revealing, the story you're telling about the development of the characters. But the questions are around mass literacy, and you said that this is one of the great changes in China, and the question is, one of them is there total literacy in China, and what effect has it had on the language, that it is no longer limited to the elite? And there's another one, I'm just going down into the Q&A to find it, the point that you made about how recent widespread literacy and education is in China. It provides some greater insight into the draconian censorship of today, and they would be interested in hearing more about issues of censorship. So essentially, the question of how literacy is changing the sort of class structures, but also that question of how it then necessitates censorship.
That's a very interesting question. So let's go back to 1919. And until that time, all formal documents and so on were written in a very dense well, not dense, it's a very economical classical style. And literature was generally written in quite a classical style. Now, I'm talking in absolutes. There's the great novels of China mix the vernacular and classical formal language. But what happened in the years leading up to 1919 and then 1919, which launched what is called the May 4th movement, is that there was this push to write with vernacular Chinese, to write as Hu Shi, one of the great thinkers of the time, said, we need to write like people talk. The language had become, the written language had become so divorced from the way people actually spoke that it was a huge impediment to literacy. So from 1919, there was a huge push for vernacular literature. That was the first stage of, and also the development of boys' schools and girls' schools and public schools in general, and all of this was going on in a very chaotic period. There was advances in literacy and so on. The communists came along and they were like, okay, in 1949, they went, what is one of the great impediments? It is the language itself. It's the way it's written. The characters are really, really complex. So we're going to take some of the most basic, there's about 2,000-3,000 characters that are necessary for basic literacy. We're going to take the most complex of those and we're going to make them really simpler to write. So they simplified the writing system. That was hugely important. And that meant that many more people were able to learn from, they weren't necessarily children, but they were able to learn characters more easily because they were easier to learn. But yes, then as you get more and more people, able to speak and express themselves, and you have a government that wants to control the narrative, censorship grows. And what we have now is, what's very interesting is in China, the internet, like everywhere else, has brought about a kind of mass democracy of expression. So the Chinese censors have had to really ramp up all levels of how they control things. So there's lists which are always changing of sensitive words. And AI systems, I don't know exactly how you describe it, but they search for those sensitive words, and bang, you know, like things disappear. And then there's also human elements and there's machine elements of the censorship system. So yes, mass literacy means there's more people saying things that you don't want them to say. Censorship is not new. There were emperors who, for example, they didn't like the fact that Mencius, who was a Confucian philosopher, he continued the thoughts of Confucius. Mencius believed that a bad ruler could be killed like you'd kill a robber, you know, like they were a criminal. If a ruler was really, really bad and they were making the people suffer, then they should go. And of course, a lot of emperors, they were like, oh yes, Mencius, very good, but not that bit. So you would have you would have the republication of Mencius's works without that bit, you know. So this censorship has always been around, but now it's become industrialized. It's not an industrial level. In terms of the exact number of the exact percentage of literacy in the mainland, I don't know. I'd have to look that up, but I think you can look that up pretty easily. That's probably Googleable.
Linda, because they have to deal with such massive issues, and you mentioned industrialization, it's the kind of machinization. Yes. So let a machine to do, but the machine do a stupid things. Then they got the crazy censorship and make so many of these a joke story now. It's a really crazy way to run the internet now. I don't know.
Yeah. And there's so many ways of getting around censorship, and it's almost like a game. So,
that's right,
for example, just a really, really short example, because I know there's more questions, is Bo Xilai was a corrupt leader of Chongqing and the party secretary of Chongqing. And he and Xi Jinping were sort of rivals, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, Bo Xilai got taken down. His wife killed an Englishman. You might all remember that. And the Communist Party did not want people talking about Bo Xilai, the corruption, all of this stuff. So if you wrote his name on a post in Weibo, China's Twitter and so on, then that would get censored, right? So people thought, how can we talk about it? And they began posting pictures of tomatoes, emojis of tomatoes, or tomato recipes. And the reason is Xi Hong Shi is a way of saying tomato in Chinese. And Xi Hong Shi, if you kind of change the characters, it can mean Western Red City, because Bo Xilai was also associated with a revolutionary sing red songs kind of movement. So people began to use tomatoes to stand in for Bo Xilai. This goes on all the time. It's so much fun. The Chinese people are so clever at getting around censorship if they want to. The state still has all of the power, but you know, people try.
Yeah. There's little moments of dissent.
I've got to just jump in here though and say that there's like two things going on, right? Because this is, and I don't mean to take away from the amazingness of Chinese language expression and everything, but there's a lot of other languages that are getting erased and locked out, and as with literacy, and it's kind of a way of forcing assimilation, erasing cultures, as well as producing all of this loveliness. And that's I actually find that's the kind of the trick with looking at the People's Republic of China or the Chinese culture. There's so much wonderful there, and I felt like a bummer saying this because there's so much like I really, really appreciate all the way that people play with things. But then, you know, I've been in situations also where people have said you're not allowed to speak. If there's one, like if you're in the Tibetan regions and then there's one Chinese person in the room, you can't speak Tibetan. Right? Like
And it's Tibetan, it's Uyghur, it's Mongolian. Recently, they've said Mongolians can't be educated in Mongolian primarily in primary school and so on. A lot of inner Mongolians are very, very distressed. But it's also even local Chinese dialect.
Yeah, of course. There's so much variety in China. That's the other thing I find is amazing, is the differences of all the different places. It's so rich and yeah.
It's a really important point that you raised, though, Ruth.
Yeah.
I might try and sneak in a couple of questions before we have to say goodbye to our guests. But one is about the Chinese government's, approach to the world, aggressive approach to the world. And actually, I think, Linda, your last chapter is called The Rise of the Wolf Warrior. And our question is about whether it's building hatred against China. So wondering about your thoughts on the effectiveness of the wolf warrior approach and whether that's actually undermining its relations with other countries and also attitudes of people to China.
Yeah, I do think that it has been a serious backfire on the international scene. I think it's been very much playing to domestic audiences because they're the ones who really love that, pushback and the anger and the making fun and the mockery and all that stuff. That plays very well among some people domestically. There's a whole lot of people who hate it, but there's a very loud and enabled, internet-enabled crowd. It is definitely hurting China, and that probably is why Xi Jinping recently said that China needs to work at building a more affable image, a more likable image. So there is a little bit of a pushback, a tamping down of that tendency, but I think we'll have to see what happens in the future. It's all still happening right now. It's all ongoing.
Yeah, I'm wondering, Baogang, do you have anything to add to that?
I think that behind this wallet diplomacy is profounding power change going on. So currently, Chinese already take over America in trade. China is the #1 trade, #1 investment, the largest investment. And then they start to challenge American financial dollar-dominate system. So then we will see more conflict will coming out. In particular, Chinese start to challenge American dollar system because Chinese figure out the trade currently only 20% trade settlement in Chinese yuan. 80% still in dollar, and the Chinese lose a lot of money if just because this arrangement.
Oh, I think we've lost your voice there.
But it's all right.
Yeah, that's good.
So they try to kind of save some money, like you use the SWIFT systems. Currently the Chinese developed their own system. So then they receive a 1.10 transaction fee. That's a huge money because you would think about Chinese total trade volume. So when the Chinese implement this kind of policy in recent years now, that will be another kind of challenge American domination. So then we will see the more conflict going on. But I go back, I think, so there's a Song and Liu the deal of us, when you're competition at the same time maintain this cooperation. So how do you manage those two together, combine together, require a skill. So this is might be useful. Go back, I think the Chinese history offers a great deal.
Yeah, and Ruth, I might get your views on this, but I am going to add a question in from one of our audience members as well, and that is that the ABC is the most trusted source of news information in Australia, but its most recent correspondent had to flee China. So how can Australians get reliable news or information about current affairs in China? Tricky question.
I've got an easy answer. Can I just jump in with it?
Linda, and then Ruth, I'll give you the last word.
Okay, easy answer for that is subscribe to things like SUP China, SUP China. They'll give you a daily bulletin with links to things from all over the world in English on culture, economics, politics, et cetera, et cetera. That's one, I would say if you have a one-stop shop, it's that one.
Terrific, thank you.
I have no idea what to say about wolf warriors. Honestly, it's like goes over my head and I don't understand it. So I think I should just shut up rather than saying something I don't understand. But I was going to say in terms of information that there's a really excellent environmental news feed called China Dialogue that I would also subscribe to as well, because I was thinking that was something that we didn't bring up and I think is like one of the biggest elements. And I actually got a lot from Linda's book about that as well, is like environmental issues and how they're affecting China, and it lays everything out for you. So SUP China and China Dialogue.
Well, I think that might be
currently one of the biggest problem for us, all of us, is disinformation used by government, used both by Washington and Beijing. So they use this disinformation as a strategy. Now this is making it really hard for us to understand what is going on now. Because many things you read, you cannot trust now. The disinformation becomes politics now, becomes a strategy.
Yeah, that's right. But I think the topic that you just brought up, Ruth, that might be a topic for when we can bring Linda to Melbourne for an actual event in 2022, and certainly a lot to talk about there as well. But unfortunately, we have run out of time, and it was a really riveting conversation. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Linda for writing this superb book. And thank you to our very engaged audience. To see the chat has been working overtime today, which is terrific to see. And I think it demonstrates that there's a lot of interest in the topic, as well as in the stories that have been discussed in tonight's event. So the webinar has been recorded. If you've registered for the event, you'll be emailed the appropriate links when they are ready. Our next scheduled La Trobe Asia webinar is on Asian monarchies in the modern age, and it's another book launch. We'll be discussing Emeritus Professor Dennis Altman's book called God Save the Queen, which might sound like it's about UK politics and or UK monarchies, and it is, but there's also a lot in the book about Asian monarchies. So don't miss that event. That will be held on 12th of October. But please follow us on Twitter at La Trobe Asia, or join our mailing list to find more details for online events and La Trobe Asia publications. But thank you all for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So much.
Thank you. Thank you, Linda. It's nice to catch up with you. Thank you. Very short, concise, precise book. Very good introduction to China.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
All.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.